Vice, its true nature in the light of the Grail Message. A clarification, correction, and enlightenment for humanity. Foreword. The hidden enemy within. Why vice is rarely understood but widely practiced. How humanity normalized what destroys the soul. A call to honest recognition and inner liberation. Vice is among the most misunderstood realities of human life. It is spoken of casually, joked about lightly, excused intellectually, and often defended emotionally. Yet its effects are anything but light. Vice does not merely disturb behavior, it undermines the inner structure of the human being. It weakens clarity, dulls conscience, and gradually separates the person from the lawful order of creation. That this process is rarely recognized is itself evidence of how deeply vice has embedded itself into modern thinking. Humanity has largely reduced vice to outward excesses or socially disapproved habits, while overlooking its true nature, a persistent inner deviation from truth and law. Vice is not defined by how loudly it announces itself, but by how quietly it corrodes the will. It often begins not with dramatic wrongdoing, but with small concessions, minor compromises of honesty, responsibility, moderation, or purity of intent. Because these concessions feel harmless, they are repeated. Through repetition, they become habit. Through habit, they harden into character. Thus vice establishes itself not as an external enemy, but as an inward ruler. One of the greatest dangers of vice lies in its normalization. Modern society frequently reframes destructive tendencies as personal freedom, self-expression, or harmless indulgence. In doing so, it silences the inner warning voice that once protected human beings from degeneration. What earlier generations instinctively recognized as harmful is now rationalized, aestheticized, or even celebrated. The result is not liberation, but confusion that spreads from individuals into families, institutions, and entire cultures. The Grail Message brings clarity where confusion reigns. It does not condemn emotionally, nor excuse sentimentally. It illuminates. In its light, vice is revealed not as a list of forbidden acts, but as a condition of inner misalignment. Vice arises wherever the human will turns away from lawful order, whether through selfishness, indulgence, pride, laziness, dishonesty, or the refusal to take responsibility for consequences. It is sustained wherever intellect overrides intuition, emotion replaces truthfulness, and convenience takes precedence over uprightness. This foreword serves as a call, not to fear vice, but to recognize it honestly. Fear blinds, recognition liberates. No human being is helped by denial, moral superiority, or self-deception. Liberation begins only when one dares to look inward without excuses, without self-hatred, and without justification. The Grail Message teaches that nothing can be healed until it is seen clearly. Vice loses its power the moment it is brought into the light of conscious recognition. Importantly, this book is not written to accuse, but to awaken. It is addressed to those who sense inwardly that something is amiss, even when outward life appears acceptable. It speaks to those who feel weakened, restless, or inwardly divided, yet cannot explain why. It also addresses those who have mistaken tolerance for wisdom, indulgence for love, and clever reasoning for truth. To all such readers, this work offers not judgment, but guidance. Vice is not stronger than the human spirit. It survives only where clarity is absent. Once the human being understands how vice operates, how it enters through small distortions of will, how it is sustained by habit, and how it drains strength, its hold can be broken. The laws of creation are not punitive, they are restorative. Whoever aligns with them finds support, renewal, and inner freedom. This book therefore invites the reader to step out of inherited misconceptions and into conscious responsibility. It invites a return to inner honesty, to discipline without harshness, and to strength without pride. Above all, it calls the human being back to dignity, the dignity of one who lives uprightly, not because of fear or convention, but because truth has been recognized and chosen. May this foreword open the way for sincere self-examination. May it prepare the ground for deeper understanding. And may it encourage the reader to walk the path of liberation, not from life, but into it, through clarity, responsibility, and alignment with the light. Introduction. What vice really is. Vice is a spiritual condition, not a moral label. Why vice is more dangerous than open evil. The Grail Message is light for unmasking inner corruption. Vice and the slow erosion of human dignity. In the common language of humanity, vice is treated as a moral insult, a word used to shame, accuse, or categorize others as bad. It is often reduced to a list of outward behaviors, habits, or excesses, judged according to cultural taste or religious rules. In this shallow understanding, vice becomes a social label rather than a condition of the soul. Such treatment not only fails to heal, it blinds the human being to the true danger vice represents. In the light of the Grail Message, vice is revealed as something far deeper and more serious, a spiritual condition arising from wrong will, repeated deviation from law, and inner negligence. Vice is not born in action, it is born in thought, inclination, and attitude. Long before it appears outwardly, it has already taken root inwardly. It is therefore possible for a person to appear respectable, moral, or even religious, while inwardly being deeply entangled in vice. Conversely, one who openly struggles and recognizes error may already be closer to liberation than one who hides corruption behind virtue signaling. Vice is dangerous precisely because it is often comfortable, gradual, and justified. Open evil shocks the conscience, vice dulls it. Open wrongdoing may awaken resistance, vice whispers excuses. It does not usually demand a sudden fall, but invites a slow descent, small compromises repeated until resistance is weakened and clarity is lost. Thus vice becomes a habit of the soul, a settled deviation from uprightness that feels normal, human, or unavoidable. From the standpoint of spiritual law, vice is persistent disharmony. It is the repeated misuse of will in a particular direction, forming grooves in the inner life through which thoughts, desires, and actions begin to flow automatically. Over time, the human being no longer chooses the vice chooses for him. This is why vice enslaves without chains and rules without force. The individual still feels free, yet is inwardly bound. The Grail Message exposes vice as a radiational condition. Every repeated wrong inclination produces a corresponding radiation that surrounds and penetrates the human being. This radiation attracts similar impulses, thoughts, and influences, strengthening the vice and making resistance increasingly difficult. Thus vice is not merely personal, it connects the individual to dark currents that reinforce error. What was once a choice becomes an atmosphere, and what was once a weakness becomes a governing power. This explains why vice is often more destructive than open evil. Open evil still recognizes itself as opposition. Vice disguises itself as normalcy, pleasure, convenience, or even virtue. It may wear the mask of tolerance, self-care, intelligence, freedom, or necessity. In this disguise, vice undermines conscience, weakens intuition, and silences the inner warning voice. The human being does not feel attacked, he feels justified. One of the most tragic aspects of vice is its effect on human dignity. Created as a being capable of conscious alignment with divine law, the human spirit is meant to stand upright, free, and responsible. Vice gradually lowers this stance. It teaches the human being to accept less of himself, to excuse weakness, to laugh at inner decay, and to trade inner clarity for temporary satisfaction. Over time, the sense of responsibility dulls, self-respect erodes, and the individual begins to live beneath his true worth. The Grail Message does not address vice with condemnation, but with clarity. It does not flatter human weakness, nor does it crush the struggling soul. Instead, it reveals the lawful consequences of inner deviation and points toward liberation through recognition. Vice cannot be overcome by suppression, fear, or external control. It can only be overcome when the human being sees it as it truly is, without excuse and without self-deception. This introduction therefore serves as a turning point. It invites the reader to stop asking, "Which vices do I have?" and begin asking, "Where have I become inwardly careless, indulgent, or untrue?" It calls for honest self-observation, not comparison with others. Vice thrives in darkness and confusion, it weakens in the presence of light and responsibility. Above all, the Grail Message restores hope. Vice is not an identity, it is a condition, and all conditions can change when the will turns rightly. The same law that allows vice to grow through repetition allows liberation to unfold through consistent uprightness. The path out of vice is not dramatic, but steady, clarity replacing confusion, discipline replacing indulgence, responsibility replacing excuse, and living recognition replacing blind habit. Thus, To understand vice correctly is already the beginning of freedom. Part 1. The Foundation of Vice. Understanding its origin and nature. Chapter 1. What is vice in the light of spiritual law? Vice is persistent deviation from law. The difference between weakness and vice. Vice is not merely an immoral act, nor is it defined by social disapproval or religious condemnation. In the light of the Grail Message, vice is a persistent inner condition, formed when the human will repeatedly chooses against the laws of creation and gradually settles into that deviation as a way of being. A single wrong act does not yet constitute vice. Humans err, stumble, and learn. Error belongs to immaturity and ignorance. Vice, however, begins where recognition is ignored, where the inner warning voice is silenced, and where wrong choice becomes habitual despite inner knowledge. Vice is therefore not primarily an external behavior, but an inner alignment. It is a state in which the will no longer strives toward what is right, pure, and lawful, but instead adapts itself to what is easier, more pleasurable, more self-serving, or more convenient, even when it is inwardly recognized as wrong. Spiritual law does not condemn, it operates. Every deviation from law creates disharmony in the radiations of the soul. When such deviation is repeated, it solidifies into a condition that resists correction. This resistance is the true danger of vice. Weakness, by contrast, still contains humility and openness. A weak person may fall, yet inwardly desires what is right and accepts correction. Vice begins when the will defends the wrong, justifies it, or reshapes truth to accommodate it. Thus, vice is not the fall, it is the refusal to rise. Chapter 2. Vice is a habitual state of the will. Repeated wrong choosing. How vice hardens inner resistance to truth. The will is the steering power of the human being. Every thought, word, and deed flows from it. When the will repeatedly turns away from what is lawful, it forms grooves, inner pathways, that soon guide behavior automatically. Vice develops when wrong choices are no longer questioned. At first, conscience speaks clearly. Discomfort arises. The soul feels unrest. But when the will repeatedly overrides these signals, the sensitivity dulls. The voice of warning grows faint, not because it disappears, but because it is deliberately ignored. This is how vice hardens. What once required justification later feels normal. What once caused shame becomes defended as human nature, personal freedom, or no one's business. In this way, vice reshapes the inner landscape, making truth appear uncomfortable and correction feel like an attack. The danger lies not in the pleasure or benefit temporarily gained through vice, but in the loss of inner responsiveness. A will caught in vice reacts with irritation, mockery, or hostility when confronted with truth, not because the truth is unclear, but because it threatens the established inner order. Thus vice is self-protective. It builds walls around itself. Spiritual progress becomes impossible until the will is softened again through honest recognition. Without this, no teaching, no sermon, no instruction can help, for vice resists light instinctively. Chapter 3. The Role of Free Will in the Formation of Vice. Why vice is always self-chosen. Responsibility cannot be shifted. No vice is imposed upon a human being. Neither society, upbringing, trauma, nor temptation can create vice without the consent of the will. External influences may invite, pressure, or seduce, but acceptance is always an inner act. This truth is uncomfortable, which is why humanity often seeks excuses. People speak of being shaped by circumstances, having no choice, or being wired that way. Yet spiritual law recognizes none of these as causes, only as tests of will. Vice forms when a person repeatedly chooses the easier path instead of the right one, despite knowing better. Every such choice strengthens the wrong inclination and weakens the will's connection to higher guidance. Responsibility cannot be shifted to parents, culture, biology, or fate. To do so is already a symptom of vice, for it evades accountability. Free will is sacred. It is the gate through which either light or darkness enters human life. When misused persistently, it does not lose its power, but it turns against its bearer, binding rather than freeing. Yet herein also lies hope. What is chosen can be unchosen. Vice may be deeply rooted, but it is never irreversible, provided the will returns to humility and seeks truth without defense. Chapter 4. Radiational Effects of Vice. How vice darkens thought, feeling, and environment. Why vice attracts corresponding forces. Nothing in creation stands still. Every inner condition radiates outward, shaping both the inner world of the soul and the outer circumstances of life. Vice alters a person's radiations, making them heavier, denser, and more disordered. This affects thinking. Clarity gives way to confusion, distortion, and rationalization. It affects feeling. Unease, irritability, dissatisfaction, or inner emptiness grow. It affects surroundings. Conflicts increase, helpful influences withdraw, and similar dispositions are attracted. Vice does not merely isolate the individual from light, it draws in reinforcing influences of the same nature. This is not punishment but lawfulness. Like attracts like. Thus, vice creates an environment in which truth feels foreign and correction feels hostile. The person may complain that life is unfair, harsh, or meaningless, without recognizing that their own inner state has shaped the experience. The Grail Message emphasizes this not to frighten, but to awaken responsibility. Radiational law is precise, impartial, and just. It offers no favoritism, but also no condemnation. It simply reflects back what is lived inwardly. To change the outer experience, the inner alignment must change first. Chapter 5. Vice versus error. Temporary mistakes versus entrenched inner corruption. One of the most harmful confusions in religious and moral teaching is the failure to distinguish between error and vice. Error belongs to learning. Vice belongs to refusal. Error occurs when a person acts wrongly due to ignorance, immaturity, or lack of clarity, and is willing to correct once recognition dawns. Such error does not darken the soul permanently, it often strengthens humility and wisdom. Vice, however, persists after recognition. It continues even when the consequences are known, the harm is evident, and the inner warning has spoken. It defends itself, excuses itself, and attacks truth to preserve comfort. This distinction is crucial, for treating error as vice leads to harshness and injustice, while treating vice as mere weakness leads to indulgence and decay. Spiritual help must be accurate. Error needs guidance. Vice needs inner decision. The Grail Message calls humanity back to this clarity, not to judge others, but to recognize oneself honestly. Only through such recognition can liberation begin. Vice is not conquered by repression, fear, or punishment. It dissolves only when the will turns again toward light, truth, and responsibility, without excuses, without self-pity, and without delay. Part 2. How Vice Develops in Human Life. The Gradual Descent into Bondage. Chapter 6. From Temptation to Habit. Vice does not arrive suddenly. It begins as a subtle temptation, often appearing harmless or even attractive. Humanity has long misunderstood the nature of temptation, seeing it as an external force rather than an invitation to choose wrongly through free will. The Grail Message clarifies that every temptation presents a choice, a moment where the human being can align with the true law or give into deviation. When the will yields repeatedly to temptation, the act transforms from a single error into a pattern, eventually solidifying into habit. This is the foundational process by which vice develops. Unlike a transient mistake, habitual vice binds the soul and diminishes the clarity of conscience. Each concession subtly reshapes the inner radiations of the soul, attracting influences that reinforce deviation and dull awareness of truth. The Grail Message warns that the more often one succumbs without recognition and correction, the more resistant the inner self becomes to upright guidance. It is crucial to understand that the initial allure of temptation is often magnified by emotional excitement or intellectual rationalization. The human mind seeks justifications, creating a veil of normality around what is actually deviation. Over time, vice can appear natural, even inevitable, because the inner will has been weakened and the soul's radiations have darkened. In this state, the human being is no longer merely reacting to external circumstances but is actively reproducing the inner conditions that perpetuate vice. True liberation, as emphasized in the Grail Message, requires awareness at the earliest stage of temptation. Recognizing the moment of choice, evaluating motives, and consciously deciding in favor of lawfulness interrupts the formation of vice. Daily vigilance, inner reflection, and adherence to spiritual principles serve as the antidote, transforming potential weakness into strength. The soul's radiations are then purified, making the human being increasingly resilient to temptation and capable of sustaining upright patterns of thought, word, and action. Chapter 7. Emotional Justifications and Self-Deception. Vice grows strongest when the human being begins to employ emotions as a shield for inner wrongdoing. The Grail Message teaches that feelings, while neutral in themselves, can become instruments of deception when they are allowed to override reason and conscience. Emotional justifications often sound reasonable internally. I deserve this, everyone does it, or, it's harmless. Yet beneath these seemingly innocent claims lies a gradual silencing of the moral compass, the inner voice that aligns with the true law. Self-deception is not merely intellectual error, it is a radiational distortion that affects the soul. When the will bends to emotions rather than lawfulness, the human being begins to perceive wrong as acceptable or even necessary. This distortion of judgment weakens the clarity of conscience, obscuring the distinction between upright action and vice. Over time, repeated emotional justifications establish patterns in thought and feeling that reinforce vice and attract similar external influences. The Grail Message emphasizes that vice is never passive, it actively shapes the inner environment, clouding insight and creating resistance to correction. Feelings alone cannot serve as guides to right action because they are inherently tied to personal desires, fear, or pleasure. When the human being allows emotional impulses to determine decisions, conscience is gradually silenced. Rationalizations replace discernment, and self-deception hides the truth from the inner eye. Without conscious intervention, this process cements inner corruption into habitual vice, making the human being increasingly blind to the spiritual consequences of their actions. The remedy, as the Grail Message clarifies, lies in cultivating self-awareness and inner truthfulness. Before yielding to emotional impulses, the human being must pause, reflect, and discern whether the choice aligns with the law. Regular inner examination, acknowledgement of motives, and adherence to the principles of upright thought, word, and action prevent emotions from overpowering conscience. By doing so, the soul strengthens its radiational clarity, restores its inner balance, and interrupts the chain of self-deception that leads to vice. Ultimately, the Grail Message reveals that only through conscious recognition of emotional influence and unwavering alignment with the true law can the human being break free from self-deception. Virtue is preserved, vice loses its hold, and the soul becomes a clear channel for light and lawful action. Chapter 8. Intellectual Rationalization of Vice. While emotional justifications pave the path of vice through feeling, the intellect often builds walls of reasoning to protect and entrench it. Intellectual rationalization occurs when the human being employs clever thinking to excuse, minimize, or even glorify wrong action. The Grail Message teaches that intelligence, like all faculties, is neutral. It becomes dangerous only when it serves self-interest rather than law. A human being may say to themselves, "This is necessary for my success, no one is really harmed," or, "I am more clever than others in managing the consequences." Such thoughts mask inner corruption with a veneer of sophistication. The mind can construct elaborate arguments to justify harmful actions, creating a seemingly rational world in which vice appears permissible. This intellectual deception is often more insidious than emotional rationalization because it appeals to pride, reason, and self-importance, which the individual may value more than truth itself. The Grail Message emphasizes that intellect must serve conscience, not replace it. When reasoning is used to rationalize vice, the radiational clarity of the soul diminishes. The human being becomes increasingly blind to the consequences of their actions, unable to perceive the subtle threads of cause and effect that link inner will, thought, and outward behavior. Intellectual rationalization allows vice to become habitual, building a fortress around the will that resists correction and insight. The antidote lies in disciplined reflection and alignment with the law. The human being must question every justification. Does this thought serve truth or self-interest? Does it honor the law or betray it? By consciously scrutinizing rationalizations, the mind becomes a servant of virtue rather than a tool of vice. The Grail Message highlights that intellectual honesty and clarity of thought restore the radiational balance, illuminate inner error, and gradually weaken the hold of vice. Ultimately, intellectual rationalization is dangerous because it convinces the human being that they are upright while simultaneously distancing them from the true law. Only through disciplined discernment, honesty, and obedience to conscience can the intellect be redirected to serve uprightness. When the mind acts in harmony with truth, the soul radiates clarity, vice loses its grip, and the human being advances toward freedom, virtue, and alignment with the light. Chapter 9. Social Approval and Collective Vice. Vice is not merely a private struggle, it often flourishes and becomes entrenched when it is reinforced by society. The human being, by nature, is sensitive to recognition and acceptance, and this need can be exploited when collective opinion validates wrong action. The Grail Message explains that society is a radiational field. The attitudes, habits, and moral states of the many affect the clarity or darkness experienced by each individual. When corruption, dishonesty, or immorality gains social approval, the soul's capacity to perceive truth is weakened. From the earliest ages, groups have rationalized collective wrongdoing, lying to maintain status, exploiting the weak for profit, or indulging in cruelty for entertainment. When these behaviors are normalized, individuals gradually adopt them without question, mistaking conformity for virtue. Social approval acts like a fog, dimming the radiational discernment that would otherwise reveal error. The Grail Message emphasizes that darkness spreads silently through human interaction. When the majority embraces vice, the individual loses courage to uphold truth, even when their inner conscience protests. The consequences of collective vice are both inner and outer. Within, the human being gradually adjusts their will and thought to the prevailing norms, allowing habit to solidify vice into character. Outwardly, societies steeped in corrupted thinking create environments where the law of life is violated daily, through injustice, exploitation, dishonesty, and the erosion of moral clarity. The Grail Message points out that these environments are spiritually heavy. The radiations of vice bind the human spirit, making upright action increasingly difficult. Yet, the law always acts impartially. Radiationally, each human being bears responsibility for the extent to which they align with truth, even within corrupt systems. Collective vice does not absolve the individual from discernment or upright choice. The Grail Message urges humanity to recognize the subtle ways social approval can seduce them into conformity with error. By consciously resisting the pull of group-mindedness, reflecting on motives, and prioritizing alignment with the law over popularity, the soul preserves clarity and moral integrity. In essence, collective vice is a test of inner strength and discernment. The more widespread a corruption, the more essential it becomes for the upright human being to act with conscious awareness. Social approval is not a measure of righteousness, only the inner alignment with law and truth determines one's moral standing. Those who resist the pressure to conform not only protect their own radiational purity but also serve as anchors of light, subtly radiating clarity to those around them. Chapter 10. Fear, Weakness, and Moral Laziness. Vice does not strike openly, it advances quietly, preying on inner hesitation and spiritual weakness. The Grail Message clarifies that fear, weakness, and moral laziness are the gateways through which vice establishes itself in human life. Where courage, conscientiousness, and self-discipline are absent, the soul becomes vulnerable to the subtle influences of error. Fear is one of the most powerful forces that allows vice to flourish. Humans often avoid standing upright because they dread social rejection, criticism, or the personal cost of truth. This fear weakens the will and dims radiational clarity, making compromise with vice appear safer than alignment with law. The Grail Message emphasizes that the law of life is impartial. Succumbing to fear does not erase responsibility. Radiationally, the human being who avoids the right path out of fear begins to attract influences that reinforce weakness, creating a spiral in which vice becomes easier to repeat and harder to resist. Weakness, in this context, is not mere physical frailty but the incapacity to uphold inner lawfulness under pressure. Human beings often justify small deviations from the upright path, convincing themselves that minor compromises are harmless. Yet, these concessions accumulate, hardening the soul against the discernment of truth. The Grail Message teaches that moral weakness is always an invitation for vice to grow, because the radiations of indecision and inconsistency provide fertile ground for error. Moral laziness is equally destructive. It manifests as a refusal to reflect, to examine motives, or to strengthen the will through conscious effort. Humans can become so accustomed to spiritual inertia that even obvious deviations from law are ignored or rationalized. The Grail Message illuminates that such laziness is a form of subtle self-destruction. the soul, unpracticed in vigilance, loses the ability to resist vice. Radiationally, laziness generates a vacuum that attracts negative influences, further weakening inner strength. Together, fear, weakness, and moral laziness form a triad that allows vice to thrive undetected. They prevent the human being from developing courage, clarity, and self-discipline, the very qualities needed to resist error. The Grail message calls for conscious awakening. Only through deliberate inner effort, daily reflection, and the cultivation of upright will can the soul maintain purity and resist vice. By facing fear, strengthening moral courage, and committing to continual self-observation, the human being establishes a protective radiational field, in which virtue is strengthened and vice loses its power. In practice, the soul must observe each decision, confront excuses, and consciously choose alignment with law. Small acts of courage, honest acknowledgement of weaknesses, and diligent effort in moral training build a foundation of inner strength. The Grail message underscores that vice cannot endure where the human being radiates clarity, steadfastness, and responsibility. Fear, weakness, and laziness may tempt, but conscious alignment with law empowers the soul to remain upright, free, and luminous even amidst widespread error. Part 3. Common misconceptions about vice. False comforts that prevent liberation. Chapter 11. Everyone does it, the lie of normalization. One of the most insidious misconceptions about vice is the belief that it is acceptable simply because it is widespread. Humanity has long relied on social validation as a measure of right and wrong, yet the Grail message clarifies that collective behavior cannot define law. The fact that the majority engages in a certain act, whether indulgence, dishonesty, or any deviation from uprightness, does not alter its alignment with the eternal principles of creation. This false comfort, everyone does it, lulls the human being into spiritual negligence and prevents liberation from inner error. Normalization masks the true consequences of vice. When an action is widely practiced, its radiational impact on the soul is ignored, and its cumulative effect on society is concealed. The Grail message emphasizes that vice carries an intrinsic spiritual law. Repeated misalignment with law darkens the inner being and distorts one's radiational field. This distortion affects thought, emotion, and influence on others. Even if the surrounding world does not openly condemn it, the soul itself suffers the consequences of deviation. The lie of normalization fosters moral laziness. Individuals justify inaction against vice by pointing to social prevalence. If everyone does it, how can it be wrong? Yet the Grail message illuminates that truth is immutable and independent of collective opinion. Uprightness is radiational, not statistical. The strength of the human being lies not in conforming to majority behavior but in aligning with law, even when alone, misunderstood, or opposed. Furthermore, normalization creates a dangerous echo chamber in which vice is reinforced. The human mind, seeking approval and belonging, gravitates toward familiar behavior patterns. This social reinforcement strengthens habitual deviation, allowing vice to flourish subtly, almost unnoticed. The Grail message warns that those who rely on social validation for moral guidance become spiritually blind, unable to recognize the lawful path even when it presents itself clearly. To overcome the illusion of normalization, the soul must cultivate independent discernment. Daily reflection, careful observation of motives, and conscious evaluation of actions against the eternal law are essential. The Grail message teaches that liberation begins when the individual ceases to measure righteousness by others' behavior and instead measures it by alignment with truth, purity, and responsibility. By breaking free from the false comfort of everyone does it, the human being strengthens inner will, clarifies perception, and restores the radiational integrity necessary to resist vice. The human being must also recognize the radiational influence of collective vice. Even if outward conformity seems harmless, radiations of habitual wrongdoing affect all within its sphere. True discernment requires courage to stand apart from societal currents, even when doing so leads to misunderstanding or isolation. The Grail message assures that steadfast alignment with law not only preserves the soul but radiates clarity, subtly influencing the environment toward uprightness. In practice, this means observing one's actions rigorously, refusing to justify wrong through social precedent, and fostering a constant dialogue with conscience and inner guidance. Small daily acts of conscious uprightness, independent of external approval, build immunity to normalization's deceptive power. The human being, by living lawfully despite majority influence, protects both personal integrity and the broader spiritual field from the subtle chains of vice. Chapter 12. Confusing vice with personality or nature. A fundamental misconception in humanity is the belief that vice is an innate part of one's personality or natural disposition. Many assume that certain tendencies, anger, selfishness, pride, or indulgence, are just who I am, thereby excusing deviation from law. The Grail Message clarifies that no vice is inherent, all deviation from righteousness arises from the misuse of free will. Every human being is born with the potential for alignment with law, and the spiritual task is to consciously cultivate uprightness rather than justify error as natural. Confusing vice with nature prevents recognition and correction. When a person attributes habitual wrongdoing to personality, they resign themselves to passivity, believing change is impossible. This surrender strengthens the vice, allowing it to harden into habitual patterns that obscure the inner voice of conscience. The Grail Message emphasizes that all vice is the result of choice, initially small, then repeated, rather than an inborn flaw. Human beings are spiritual beings first. The body and personality are instruments through which the soul manifests, and they are never the source of moral corruption. Personality traits, emotions, or tendencies may incline a person towards certain behaviors, but they do not compel vice. Anger may arise, pride may be felt, and selfish impulses may occur, but the critical factor is how these impulses are recognized, judged, and acted upon. The Grail Message teaches that true uprightness lies in awareness, decision, and responsible action. When a human being learns to observe impulses without being driven by them, the soul gains mastery over conditions that might otherwise lead to vice. This confusion also leads to the dangerous justification of societal and cultural vices. Parents, teachers, and leaders often excuse misbehavior with phrases like, "boys will be boys," or, "she is just naturally that way," creating an environment where accountability is diminished. Humanity collectively loses the ability to distinguish between lawful choice and unconscious indulgence. The Grail Message illuminates that lawfulness is always possible, no matter the apparent strength of personality traits, because the soul is not bound by inherited or natural characteristics, it is bound only by the choices made in conscious recognition of law. Furthermore, the illusion that vice is natural diminishes moral effort. When individuals perceive their tendencies as unchangeable, they cease exercising discernment and discipline, allowing small errors to become habitual, then entrenched. Radiationally, this weakens both personal character and the influence on the environment. The Grail Message insists that awareness, reflection, and deliberate alignment with law are the only pathways to liberation from vice. Practical application begins with recognizing impulses as signals, not determinants. Daily observation of thought, emotion, and action, coupled with conscious reflection on law and responsibility, allows the human being to separate temporary impulses from permanent character. Over time, the soul strengthens, moral clarity increases, and what was once mistakenly perceived as innate personality transforms into conscious virtue. In summary, vice is never a gift of nature or birthright. It is always a self-chosen condition, reinforced by habit, justification, and inattention to the inner voice. By understanding this, humanity can reclaim responsibility for moral direction, cultivate freedom from error, and progressively align with the true law. Recognizing vice as learned and therefore correctable is the first step toward liberation, clarity, and the radiational purity that supports spiritual growth. Chapter 13. Emotional Sympathy for Vice. When compassion becomes indulgence. Humanity often confuses emotional sympathy with true understanding, particularly when confronted with vice. The Grail Message reveals that the soul must distinguish between genuine compassion, which seeks guidance and correction, and indulgence, which permits vice to flourish under the guise of kindness. Emotional sympathy without lawfulness becomes a vehicle for error, allowing inner corruption to spread both within the individual and into the wider environment. Sympathy for another's vice frequently arises from sentimentality, fear, or the desire for social approval. Observing someone commit an error, the natural impulse of the untrained heart is to excuse it. They are struggling, everyone makes mistakes, or they can't help themselves. Though superficially kind, these thoughts weaken the moral responsibility of both parties. The Grail Message clarifies that indulgence of vice under the cloak of sympathy is not love, it is a radiational compromise that dims the human being's capacity for uprightness and clarity. True compassion requires recognition of law and a firm will to act in accordance with it. It does not repress the heart or diminish mercy, but it ensures that kindness does not permit wrongdoing to continue unchecked. Allowing vice to persist under sympathetic justification leads to inner confusion, moral weakening, and ultimately, to greater suffering for all involved. The soul must see the inner lawfulness behind correction. Love without lawfulness is incomplete and can even become harmful. Emotional sympathy for vice also manifests in self-deception. Many rationalize their indulgence of others' vices as generosity or tolerance. Yet tolerance without moral clarity is passive acceptance of corruption, and radiationally it aligns with the forces of error rather than truth. The Grail Message emphasizes that every act carries radiational consequences. By permitting vice out of false sympathy, the human being not only weakens personal inner strength but also contributes to the propagation of darkness in the environment. Practical application involves observing the interplay of heart and conscience. When faced with another's misdeed, the first step is inner recognition, understanding the nature of the vice and its consequences, not merely reacting emotionally. The second step is measured action, offering guidance, boundaries, or correction in alignment with law, rather than letting sentiment override duty. Sympathy, when informed by truth and radiational responsibility, strengthens both the observer and the observed, creating conditions for genuine improvement. In summary, the Grail Message teaches that compassion must always be guided by upright recognition. Emotional indulgence for vice is a dangerous error, as it radiationally supports darkness and obscures truth. True sympathy strengthens lawfulness, encourages accountability, and fosters the growth of virtue. Recognizing the difference between indulgence and constructive guidance is a decisive step in living lawfully, protecting the soul, and elevating the environment through the radiational strength of upright action. Chapter 14. Religious Excuses and False Grace. Forgiveness misunderstood as permission. Humanity has long confused forgiveness with license. The Grail Message illuminates that the true law operates independently of human sentiment, and forgiveness, when rightly understood, is a recognition of the soul's potential for correction, not a justification for vice. Many hide behind religious phrases, claiming that errors are excused because God forgives, or grace covers all. This is a distortion that misguides both conscience and action, allowing vice to persist under the guise of spiritual approval. False grace is particularly insidious because it presents itself as moral superiority or compassion. People rationalize ongoing error. I can indulge myself because I am forgiven, or others cannot judge me because of grace. In reality, the soul's radiational state is unaffected by human excuses. Lawfulness cannot be circumvented by clever phrases or emotional comfort. True forgiveness is not a shield for vice but a call to return to uprightness, responsibility, and recognition of consequences. Religious excuses often arise from fear, laziness, or pride. They remove the necessity for inner examination, allowing the individual to continue destructive behavior without confronting the inner imbalance. The Grail Message warns that such rationalizations generate radiational confusion, weakening the will, obscuring conscience, and entangling the soul in recurring patterns of error. Spiritual teaching without practical uprightness becomes a source of further deviation rather than guidance. Constructive application requires distinguishing between forgiveness as a state of alignment with law and indulgence as an avoidance of responsibility. The righteous course is to recognize errors honestly, accept consequences, and realign action with lawfulness. Spiritual principles are not mere words, they are living, radiational truths that demand active recognition and disciplined application. When applied correctly, grace strengthens, uplifts, and purifies. It does not excuse or perpetuate vice. In everyday life, one observes whether acts claimed as forgiven are repeated without correction. If they are, the soul must confront the reality: forgiveness has not yet been understood as a call to upright action. True grace motivates change, cultivates responsibility, and radiates purity. False grace, however, permits indulgence, dulls conscience, and sustains vice. The Grail Message illuminates this distinction clearly, guiding the human being to live in truth, not in deceptive comfort. In conclusion, religious excuses and the misuse of grace are not expressions of divine love but of human misunderstanding. Recognition, responsibility, and correction are the real fruits of forgiveness. Aligning one's inner life with these principles ensures that grace becomes a force for purification, not a cover for error. Every human being must learn to see beyond words, to discern the radiational reality behind claimed mercy, and to act in accordance with law, thereby transcending vice and fostering spiritual growth. Chapter 15. Intellectual Pride and Moral Blindness. When knowledge increases corruption. Intellectual pride is one of the most subtle yet pervasive forms of vice. The Grail Message reveals that knowledge, when divorced from upright will and recognition of law, becomes not a path to wisdom but a tool for self-exaltation. A human being may accumulate information, mastery of arts, or command over ideas and yet remain spiritually blind if moral discernment does not guide the intellect. The higher the acquired skill or learning, the greater the potential for corruption, if it is not tempered by humility and responsibility. This form of vice manifests as self-deception, the belief that intellectual capacity alone confers righteousness. Many mistake clever reasoning, eloquence, or technical skill for moral insight. In reality, intellect without conscience merely sharpens the capacity to justify wrongdoing, manipulate others, and obscure truth, often without the person even noticing. This is the precise danger the Grail Message warns about. Knowledge without alignment with law and upright will does not illuminate, but darkens. Moral blindness is the natural consequence of intellectual pride. The soul becomes desensitized to inner guidance and radiational truth. The person may act in ways that are harmful, yet rationalize these actions with logic, philosophy, or religious reasoning. Radiationally, such individuals emit confusion rather than clarity, spreading subtle darkness in their environment. The Grail Message emphasizes that the more developed the intellect, the more responsibility rests upon the will to discern, purify motives, and act in alignment with truth. Otherwise, pride becomes a magnifying lens for vice. The remedy lies in humility before the law and recognition of the higher purpose of knowledge, to serve the soul, uplift life, and act in harmony with the divine order. Intellectual pursuits must be guided by conscience, tempered by self-examination, and purified through upright intention. True wisdom is inseparable from virtue. Knowledge without virtue is a seed for inner corruption. In practical life, this means examining whether the use of intellect strengthens alignment with truth or merely satisfies ego. Are arguments used to enlighten and uplift, or to dominate, deceive, or avoid responsibility? Are decisions guided by law, or by clever manipulation of circumstance? The Grail Message clarifies that inner integrity, responsibility, and humility are the measures by which knowledge must be tested. Only then does the intellect serve life rather than enslave it to vice. In conclusion, intellectual pride is a gateway to moral blindness. The Grail Message teaches that the human being must recognize the limitations of intellect without upright will, cultivate humility, and allow moral discernment to guide thought and action. Knowledge becomes virtue only when applied lawfully, otherwise, it becomes vice disguised as accomplishment, trapping the soul in cycles of error and radiational confusion. True wisdom radiates light, while pride distorts and darkens. Part 4. The Major Forms of Vice. How Vice Manifests in Daily Life. Chapter 16. Sensual Vice and the Degradation of the Body. Lust, excess, and misuse of life force. The Grail Message teaches that the human body is a sacred vessel, designed to house and transmit the life force entrusted to every soul. Sensual vice arises when this life force is misdirected through lust, indulgence, or uncontrolled physical desire. Such misuse does not merely affect the body, it clouds thought, weakens the will, and distorts the soul's radiational clarity. Lust, when untethered from moral and spiritual law, enslaves the human being. It reduces the creative power inherent in the life force to mere gratification of the senses, severing it from its true purpose, the continuation of life in alignment with divine order and the evolution of the soul. Excessive indulgence generates inner emptiness, moral disorientation, and energetic depletion. The Grail Message makes clear that the human being is not condemned for experiencing natural impulses, but becomes accountable when these impulses dominate reason, conscience, and upright intent. Misuse of sensuality also radiates disorder into the environment. Radiationally, the distorted energies of lust attract confusion, unrest, and subtle influences that reinforce vice. This is why societies and individuals steeped in sensual excess are often afflicted by restlessness, dissatisfaction, and moral confusion, the inner law is violated, and its radiational consequences ripple outward. Furthermore, sensual vice is rarely confined to physical expression alone, it manifests in thought, fantasy, and imagination. The Grail Message emphasizes that purity of thought is inseparable from bodily discipline. Only when the life force is consciously guided and honored can the human being maintain clarity, moral strength, and spiritual radiance. The remedy lies in conscious recognition and self-discipline. The human being must acknowledge the sacredness of the body and the life force, restrain impulses that are not aligned with lawfulness, and cultivate moderation and inner awareness. By directing sensuality into lawful channels, whether creative, familial, or spiritually uplifting, the soul remains untainted, and the body becomes a true instrument of divine service rather than a conduit of vice. In daily life, this requires vigilance, recognizing early signs of indulgence, understanding the radiational consequences of lust, and cultivating practices that strengthen will, conscience, and inner integrity. Sensual vice is therefore not merely a physical matter, but a spiritual condition that touches every facet of life. Purity, self-control, and upright intent restore balance, protect the soul, and allow the human being to walk in lawfulness, radiating light rather than inviting darkness. Chapter 17. Vice of the Tongue and Thought. Lying, gossip, mockery, and inner malice. The Grail Message illuminates that vice is not limited to the physical plane, it resides as profoundly in thought and speech. The human being wields immense creative power through the word and the mind, and misuse of this power constitutes a major form of vice. Lying, gossip, mockery, and inner malice are expressions of will and intention that distort the natural law and radiate dissonance into the spiritual and social environment. Lying begins when the will chooses self-interest, fear, or pride over truthfulness. Even small falsehoods, repeated unconsciously, create a habitual distortion of reality, corrupting thought patterns and weakening the moral compass. The Grail Message clarifies that no lie can remain hidden from the law. Every distortion carries radiational consequences that affect both the individual and those in proximity. Gossip and slander operate similarly, but with the added danger of contagion. Words spoken in malice or carelessness do not merely convey information, they transmit energy that can harm reputations, destroy trust, and seed inner unrest. Mockery, derision, and judgmental speech foster a climate of fear and defensiveness, reinforcing vice in both speaker and listener. The human being may believe these are trivial acts, yet the Grail Message shows that the subtle radiations of malicious thought and speech accumulate, binding the soul in patterns of vice. Inner malice, hidden resentment, envy, or desire for another's harm, is perhaps the most insidious. It does not require expression to exert influence, its radiational effect attracts darkness, distorts perception, and invites repetition of vice in actions and words. Thus, inner thought shapes outer life, unexamined malice becomes an unseen yet powerful vice. The remedy lies in conscious recognition and disciplined correction. First, the human being must observe the contents of thought and speech without justification or self-deception. Practices such as reflection, meditation, and questioning motives strengthen awareness and allow the will to realign with lawfulness. Truthfulness must be cultivated as a virtue in thought before it manifests in words. Compassion, restraint, and clarity replace malice, gossip, and mockery, transforming the tongue from an instrument of darkness into one of light. Daily vigilance is required, monitoring the energy of thoughts, avoiding speech that harms, and correcting inner impulses before they externalize. By maintaining the purity of mind and tongue, the human being protects radiational integrity, fosters upright relationships, and diminishes the grip of vice. The Grail Message teaches that mastery over the tongue and thought is not merely ethical, it is essential for spiritual evolution and the preservation of inner peace. Chapter 18. Vice of Power, Control, and Manipulation. Domination disguised as leadership. The Grail Message teaches that vice can subtly infiltrate even the most respected human roles when the will seeks domination rather than alignment with law. The misuse of power, the urge to control others, and the employment of manipulation represent profound departures from the upright exercise of human faculties. These vices are not always recognized because they often masquerade as leadership, guidance, or care. The radiational effect of such vice, however, is unmistakable. Confusion, fear, dependence, and spiritual stagnation arise wherever control is exercised unlawfully. True leadership, in the Grail sense, is rooted in lawfulness, integrity, and service. It empowers without coercion, directs without dominating, and radiates strength without causing fear. By contrast, the vice of power arises when the will seeks self-interest, pride, or superiority. Control is exerted through threats, emotional pressure, exploitation, or deceit, bending others to personal aims rather than aligning with higher law. Manipulation, often subtle, exploits weakness, ignorance, or sentiment, creating attachments that bind the souls of those affected. This vice extends into all areas of life, in the family, workplace, social groups, and even religious settings. Its hallmark is the inversion of service. What should uplift others instead serves the ambitions or insecurities of the manipulator. The Grail message clarifies that radiationally, these actions attract corresponding disturbances, creating cycles of resistance, unrest, and eventual personal suffering. Power misused inevitably binds the one who seeks it. Overcoming this vice requires conscious self-observation and honest recognition of intent. The human being must examine every desire for control, every impulse to dominate, and every manipulation of circumstances or people. True correction does not lie in external opposition but in inner transformation, aligning the will with law, cultivating humility, and exercising authority only as service to truth and good. Leadership becomes radiationally upright when it emanates from inner clarity, moral strength, and responsibility rather than ego-driven ambition. Daily vigilance involves questioning motives, observing interpersonal dynamics, and choosing lawfulness over personal gain. Guidance, persuasion, or influence must always be measured against alignment with universal law, ensuring that action uplifts rather than binds. In this way, the human being transforms power into virtue, replacing manipulation with integrity, coercion with persuasion, and domination with service. The Grail message thus reveals that mastery over the vice of power is essential for spiritual evolution. Only those who can govern themselves and align authority with law can radiate true strength, illuminate others, and stand free from the binding effects of vice. Through disciplined self-reflection, upright exercise of responsibility, and radiational purity, the human being liberates both self and others from the subtle tyranny of this pervasive vice. Chapter 19. Vice of Greed, Dishonesty, and Exploitation. Wealth without responsibility. The Grail message illuminates that greed and dishonesty are not merely social failings, they are inner vices that arise from the distortion of the human will and a deviation from the true law of creation. Greed is the desire to accumulate beyond lawful need, not for service or constructive purpose, but to satisfy ego, insecurity, or ambition. Dishonesty is the conscious or unconscious bending of truth to achieve advantage. Exploitation occurs when another's labor, trust, or vulnerability is used for personal gain. Together, these vices form a triad of spiritual corruption that corrodes the soul and disturbs the radiational harmony of life. Wealth and possessions are not inherently evil. They are instruments of responsibility, tools for support, and channels for lawful action. The vice arises when they are sought or held without recognition of this lawfulness. A person who accumulates selfishly radiates a vibration of want, fear, and imbalance, attracting corresponding disturbances into both personal life and wider society. Exploitation of others' weaknesses or ignorance compounds this effect, binding both victim and perpetrator in cycles of moral and spiritual debt. Dishonesty, whether in speech, contracts, or intention, further separates the human being from truth. Even small compromises in integrity become habitual deviations from law, conditioning the will toward further vice. The Grail message emphasizes that lawfulness is not external, it begins within, in the clarity of motive and the purity of intent. One cannot externalize righteousness by merely following rules while internally desiring selfish gain. Inner corruption radiates outward inevitably. Overcoming these vices requires the conscious recognition of their radiational impact. Individuals must examine desires for wealth, question motives behind acquisition, and assess whether actions serve law, justice, and the welfare of others. True correction lies not in renunciation alone, but in aligning gain with responsibility, cultivating honesty in thought and action, and using resources as channels for good. Wealth, when integrated with virtue, becomes a force for upliftment rather than bondage. Daily practice involves vigilance over personal motivations, or choices inspired by fear, envy, or ego, or are they guided by lawfulness, duty, and service? Upright alignment transforms the use of resources into a radiationally positive influence. Dishonesty is replaced by transparency, greed by lawful moderation, and exploitation by equitable engagement. Through this disciplined self-mastery, the human being transcends the vice of wealth misused and attains inner freedom, becoming a vessel of clarity, abundance in lawfulness, and enduring spiritual strength. The Grail Message reveals that the liberation from greed, dishonesty, and exploitation is not optional, it is essential for spiritual evolution. Only through upright handling of resources and conscious recognition of their lawfulness can the human being contribute to harmony, radiate light, and resist the subtle entanglements of vice that entrap the soul. Chapter 20. Vice of Envy, Jealousy, and Malice. Envy, jealousy, and malice are among the most subtle and corrosive vices of the human soul. Unlike greed or lust, which manifest visibly in action, these vices often operate internally, hidden in thought and feeling, quietly distorting perception and radiational influence. The Grail Message illuminates that these conditions are born from an inner imbalance, a failure to recognize the divine law of equality and the rightful distribution of life's gifts. Envy is the inward comparison of self with others, accompanied by discontent over another's abilities, possessions, or position. It is a reflection of unacknowledged insecurity and a desire to possess what is not lawfully one's own. The human being who succumbs to envy measures themselves by another's light rather than their own alignment with law. This distorted focus generates inner turbulence and a radiational pull that attracts disharmony. Jealousy is closely related, but it carries a personal attachment, the fear of losing what one believes is rightfully theirs, whether love, recognition, or status. It is rooted in possession, attachment, and fear, rather than lawful stewardship or responsible enjoyment. Jealousy blinds the will, feeding suspicion, defensive action, and reactive thinking, all of which are far removed from the clarity of uprightness. Malice, the active manifestation of envy and jealousy, is the intent to harm another. Even when cloaked in reason or subtle manipulation, malice radiates darkness and disturbs both the perpetrator and the target. The Grail Message explains that every thought of ill will is a radiational disturbance, creating chains of consequence that extend beyond immediate action. Malice corrodes trust, sows discord, and attracts counterforces of similar nature, gradually binding the human being in spiritual and moral limitation. These vices are self-perpetuating because they distort perception. The envious person cannot see the divine order in another's success, the jealous mind cannot trust the stability of life's flow, the malicious heart cannot recognize the harm it brings upon itself. They thrive in ignorance, emotionalism, and unchecked imagination, often rationalized by ego or misunderstood justice. The path of liberation lies in the conscious recognition of these inner tendencies. The Grail Message teaches that clarity of vision, honesty with oneself, and the cultivation of inner contentment are essential. By aligning thought and motive with lawfulness, the human being can transform envy into aspiration guided by responsibility, jealousy into care for what is lawfully theirs, and malice into protective uprightness that serves rather than destroys. Daily exercises in reflection, detachment from comparison, and strengthening the capacity to rejoice in another's lawful gain cultivate radiational purity. The upright soul learns to measure itself by alignment with law and truth, not by the fortunes or qualities of others. In this way, the human being gradually dissolves the inner seeds of envy, jealousy, and malice, replacing them with serenity, moral clarity, and the radiational ability to influence others positively. Ultimately, the Grail Message clarifies, vice is not merely external action, it is a distortion of will and perception. Envy, jealousy, and malice are overcome not through condemnation or external correction, but through inner transformation, purifying motive, strengthening the will, and abiding in the light of law. Only then does the soul radiate virtue, attract harmony, and free itself from the subtle chains of inner corruption. Chapter 21. Vice of Laziness, Neglect, and Weak Will. Laziness, neglect, and weak will are vices that may appear harmless, yet their subtlety makes them highly destructive to the human soul. Unlike more dramatic vices such as malice or greed, these conditions quietly erode the strength of character, the clarity of purpose, and the alignment with divine law. The Grail Message reveals that the human being is endowed with free will to act uprightly, but when this will is weak or neglected, life force becomes dissipated, and the soul drifts into passivity and vulnerability. Laziness is not merely the avoidance of physical effort, it is an inner withdrawal from duty, learning, and conscious effort toward alignment with law. It manifests as procrastination, disinterest, or the refusal to act when action is necessary. The radiational effect of laziness is subtle but pervasive. It diminishes vitality, clouds judgment, and allows external influences, both good and bad, to shape the individual without discernment. The Grail Message warns that habitual laziness weakens spiritual perception, leaving the soul unarmed against deception and error. Neglect arises when the human being fails to attend to what is morally, spiritually, or practically required. This may appear as carelessness in personal conduct, oversight in relationships, or inattention to responsibilities. Yet neglect carries consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Unfulfilled duties generate disturbances in radiational law, impacting the human's environment, influencing others negatively, and gradually binding the soul in disorder. Neglect is not a passive vice, it is an active resistance to the recognition of duty and law, a refusal to use the gifts of will, reason, and conscience. Weak will is the inability to uphold decisions, maintain focus on what is right, or resist temptation. It is the root of vacillation, indecision, and susceptibility to external persuasion. A weak will allows lower impulses and vice to dominate, and it disturbs inner harmony. The Grail Message teaches that the strength of will is directly tied to clarity of purpose and alignment with law. A weak will leads not only to personal disorder but also to the inadvertent perpetuation of vice in society, because the individual radiates indecision, instability, and receptivity to error. The liberation from these vices begins with recognition. Laziness, neglect, and weak will are overcome through conscious daily effort, by cultivating discipline, establishing structured action in thought and deed, and exercising responsibility for every decision. The Grail Message emphasizes that even small acts of uprightness strengthen the will and purify radiations. Persistent attention to duty, self-observation, and deliberate engagement in moral and practical responsibilities build resilience. Moreover, these vices are often intertwined. Laziness encourages neglect, and neglect erodes the will. Only through active awareness and the conscious application of lawfulness can the human being restore inner power. Repeated exercises in self-discipline, thoughtful reflection, and the alignment of intention with purpose create a virtuous cycle. Energy returns, radiations clear, and the soul's influence becomes constructive rather than passive or destructive. Ultimately, the Grail Message clarifies that vice is not simply failure, it is the distortion of will, attention, and responsibility. By awakening the will, attending faithfully to duties, and cultivating inner strength, the human being not only liberates themselves from the subtle chains of laziness, neglect, and weak will but also becomes a source of radiational stability, moral influence, and upright example in a world often governed by passivity and indecision. Chapter 22, Vice of Pride, Arrogance, and Vanity. Pride, arrogance, and vanity are vices that mask themselves as confidence, achievement, or superiority, yet they are deeply destructive to the soul. Unlike weakness, which manifests as passivity, these vices appear active and attractive to the human ego. The Grail Message clarifies that the root of these vices is the false elevation of the self above law and truth, a radiational misalignment that blinds the individual to reality and severs connection with higher guidance. Pride is the overestimation of one's own worth, capacity, or moral standing. It blinds the human being to personal shortcomings, the needs of others, and the lawfulness that governs existence. Pride radiates outward, influencing others subtly through condescension, judgment, or superiority, and internally it binds the soul in self-deception. Radiationally, pride disturbs harmony, it repels light and invites resistance from those aligned with truth, creating conflict and isolation. Arrogance builds upon pride by transforming self-estimation into active assertion over others. Arrogance seeks recognition, dominance, or control, and it misuses intellect, talent, and energy to elevate the ego. The Grail Message emphasizes that arrogance is always a misplacement of will. Instead of submitting to law, the individual submits to personal desire. This misalignment strengthens the Luciferic principle, distorting judgment and obscuring understanding of what is right. Arrogance provokes opposition, as the soul unconsciously challenges the lawful order of creation, bringing consequences that often appear externally as setbacks, criticism, or conflict. Vanity is the pursuit of approval and admiration, a preoccupation with appearance or reputation rather than with inner substance. It is the most subtle of these vices, for it can exist beneath a veneer of humility or charm. Vanity generates constant inner unrest because it relies upon external affirmation. The human being becomes reactive to every judgment, flattering comment, or comparison. Spiritually, vanity depletes radiational strength, for energy is expended on self-absorption rather than constructive action aligned with law. The Grail Message teaches that these vices are interrelated. Pride inflates, arrogance acts, and vanity craves acknowledgement. They are the outward expressions of inner separation from truth, and they all distort radiations, impair clarity of judgment, and perpetuate error. Their consequences are both personal and social. They obstruct moral insight, disturb relationships, and contribute to a culture of deception, competitiveness, and hidden hostility. Liberation from these vices begins with honest self-recognition. The human being must examine motives, acknowledge weaknesses, and consciously align the will with law and truth. Humility, the direct antidote, is not self-deprecation but recognition of one's true place in creation. By cultivating self-observation, practicing modesty in thought and action, and resisting the urge to compare oneself with others, the soul gradually restores radiational harmony. The Grail Message emphasizes that genuine greatness lies not in outward elevation, but in upright conduct, clarity, and service aligned with law. Pride, arrogance, and vanity dissolve when the human being shifts focus from the self to constructive action and moral responsibility. Through consistent inner work, reflection, and alignment with truth, the soul emerges from these vices, radiating steadiness, insight, and lawful influence. Ultimately, overcoming pride, arrogance, and vanity is liberation from the seduction of self, allowing the human being to stand in clarity, humility, and radiational strength. Only then can inner light shine without distortion, and only then can the individual act as a constructive force in the world, resisting the subtle sway of error and embracing the guiding principle of uprightness. Chapter 23, Vice of Anger, Hatred, and Resentment. Anger, hatred, and resentment are vices that consume the human being from within, distorting perception, judgment, and radiational alignment. The Grail Message clarifies that these are not mere emotional reactions but entrenched states of will and thought that separate the soul from law and truth. They arise when the human being allows external circumstances or perceived injuries to dominate the inner life, giving power to forces that thrive on separation, revenge, and darkness. Anger is the immediate eruption of inner disturbance in response to perceived opposition or injustice. While natural as a fleeting impulse, when habitual, anger becomes a vice. It clouds discernment, energizes reactionary thought, and radiates tension into both the inner and outer environment. The Grail Message emphasizes that persistent anger is a refusal to submit to law and order. It is a misalignment of will that perpetuates inner unrest and provokes reciprocal disturbances from the world. Hatred grows from anger that has taken root and hardened into judgment. Unlike anger, which is often transient, hatred is enduring and directed against a person, group, or condition. Spiritually, it is corrosive. It poisons the soul, diminishes radiational clarity, and binds the human being in self-deception. Hatred distorts perception, leading the individual to see evil where there may be none or to exaggerate faults beyond their true measure. This vice attracts corresponding dark radiations, creating cycles of conflict that reinforce the Luciferic principle in both the individual and collective spheres. Resentment is the inward, passive continuation of anger and hatred. It is silent, persistent, and often disguised beneath politeness or calm. The Grail Message explains that resentment is particularly dangerous because it silently undermines the soul's capacity for upright recognition and lawful action. It hardens the heart, diminishes empathy, and feeds subtle vindictiveness. Unlike outward aggression, resentment consumes energy internally, weakening moral vigilance and obscuring the perception of lawful cause and effect. These vices are interrelated. Anger ignites, hatred hardens, and resentment sustains. Together, they create a chain that traps the soul in cycles of self-justification, bitterness, and reaction. Radiationally, they disturb harmony and attract forces that perpetuate error and suffering. Socially, they manifest as conflict, hostility, and injustice, often escalating beyond personal grievance into collective unrest. Liberation from these vices begins with conscious recognition. The human being must observe impulses without acting upon them blindly, trace the origin of hurt or judgment, and consciously choose alignment with law and truth. The Grail Message emphasizes inner work, replacing reaction with reflection, seeking understanding instead of retaliation, and cultivating patience, forgiveness, and clarity. This does not mean tolerating injustice blindly but exercising discernment and willfulness in accordance with divine law. Through persistent practice, the soul gradually dissolves the grip of anger, hatred, and resentment. The energy once expended in reaction is redirected toward constructive action, moral responsibility, and upright influence. Radiational clarity returns, the human being experiences inner freedom, and relationships can be guided by justice rather than impulse. Ultimately, overcoming these vices is liberation from the dominion of darkness within oneself. By transforming anger, hatred, and resentment into awareness, lawful action, and compassion, the human being aligns with the true principle, radiates strength without aggression, and becomes a stabilizing force in a world often disturbed by misdirected emotions. Chapter 24: Vice of Fear, Anxiety, and Despair. Fear, anxiety, and despair are subtle yet deeply binding vices that obstruct the soul's recognition of truth, law, and light. Unlike anger or outwardly visible vices, they primarily affect the inner life, eroding clarity, courage, and the capacity to act in alignment with the true principle. The Grail Message explains that these vices are not inherent in human nature but arise when the will allows itself to detach from divine law and trust in the ordering of life. Fear is the anticipation of harm, loss, or failure. While natural in occasional measure, habitual fear becomes a vice when it dictates thought, speech, and action. Spiritually, fear is a misjudgment of reality. The human being assumes personal weakness against the universal order and forgets that alignment with law and upright action is protective. Fear distorts perception, fosters avoidance, and attracts negative radiations that amplify inner tension. It is the gateway through which darkness exerts influence, as fear closes the mind to reason and intuition. Anxiety arises when fear becomes constant, simmering beneath consciousness, creating a state of persistent agitation. It is the mind's preoccupation with imagined or exaggerated outcomes, producing tension and inner unrest. The Grail Message highlights that anxiety is a misplacement of trust. The human being seeks control over what is governed by universal law and the unfolding of divine order. This vice weakens moral vigilance, diminishes energy for constructive action, and prevents the cultivation of inner stability. Despair is the culmination of fear and anxiety left unchecked. It is the conviction that all effort is futile, that life or self is incapable of alignment with law or the attainment of purpose. Spiritually, despair is a profound deviation from recognition of the true principle. It shuts the soul off from guidance, silences the conscience, and obscures the path of righteous action. Despair immobilizes the will, leaving the human being passive in the face of error, and often invites deeper misalignment with the Luciferic principle through resignation or inner surrender to doubt. These vices are interlinked. Fear initiates, anxiety sustains, and despair completes a cycle of inner bondage. Radiationally, they darken the aura, diminish receptivity to the light, and attract corresponding forces that reinforce insecurity, confusion, and stagnation. Socially, they manifest as dependency, indecision, and susceptibility to manipulation, undermining both personal growth and societal harmony. Liberation begins with conscious recognition. The human being must observe fear and anxiety without surrender, discerning between lawful caution and inner distortion. The Grail Message emphasizes alignment with truth, understanding that life unfolds under divine law, that personal effort guided by upright will is protective, and that recognition of law and inner uprightness dispels the illusion of helplessness. Practical steps involve daily exercises of will and clarity, focusing thought on lawful action, cultivating inner courage through reflection, and reaffirming trust in the ordering of life. The cultivation of patience, mindfulness, and radiational awareness gradually reduces the influence of these vices. Despair, once recognized, can be dissolved through conscious connection with truth and purposeful action, restoring hope and vitality to the soul. Ultimately, overcoming fear, anxiety, and despair is liberation from internal bondage. By transforming these vices into awareness, trust, and lawful effort, the human being strengthens inner freedom, aligns with the true principle, and becomes a stabilizing, illuminating force in a world often clouded by doubt and insecurity. Chapter 25. Spiritual Vice. Spiritual vice is the subtle corruption of the soul's uprightness, manifesting not through obvious wrongdoing but through distortion of one's inner alignment with truth and law. It appears as hypocrisy, self-righteousness, or false piety, behaviors that give the illusion of virtue while masking inner deviation from the true principle. Unlike other vices, spiritual vice operates under the guise of holiness, often deceiving both the individual and others. Hypocrisy is the deliberate presentation of a false spiritual image. It arises when the human being seeks recognition or influence without true alignment of will and intention. The Grail Message explains that hypocrisy is not merely a social failing but a radiational disturbance. The soul emits contradictory energies, claiming light while internally resisting its guidance. Such imbalance clouds judgment, attracts misunderstanding, and gradually hardens the conscience, making genuine recognition of truth increasingly difficult. Self-righteousness is an overestimation of one's own spiritual status or moral achievement. It thrives on comparison and judgment of others, producing superiority, pride, and internal rigidity. Spiritually, self-righteousness is dangerous because it replaces inner obedience to law with outer evaluation, leading the human being to believe that status or appearance can substitute for alignment with truth. Radiationally, it repels truth and invites corrective influences, often manifesting as opposition, conflict, or internal unrest. False piety is the outward display of devotion, often motivated by fear, gain, or vanity rather than genuine recognition of the true principle. It confuses ritual or appearance with spiritual substance. The Grail Message teaches that authentic piety is expressed through lawfulness, purity, and conscientious action, not through mechanical observances or the pursuit of acclaim. False piety binds the soul in routine, leaving it insensitive to the radiations of truth and blind to its own distortions. The consequences of spiritual vice are profound. Internally, it weakens moral discernment, clouds intuition, and diminishes receptivity to higher guidance. Externally, it misleads others, contaminates relationships, and corrupts the moral fabric of society. The human being may appear upright, yet radiationally and spiritually, the presence of vice erodes the potential for genuine light, growth, and fulfillment. Liberation from spiritual vice requires conscious recognition, humility, and honest self-assessment. One must examine motives, discern between appearance and inner truth, and cultivate alignment with divine law through reflection, upright action, and consistent effort. The Grail Message emphasizes that only by recognizing and correcting these inner distortions can the soul radiate true virtue, receive the protective influence of light, and become a stabilizing force in the world. Ultimately, the victory over spiritual vice is the restoration of integrity, the purification of radiations, and the establishment of a soul that mirrors truth, lawfulness, and light. By dissolving hypocrisy, self-righteousness, and false piety, the human being becomes a genuine bearer of virtue, free from the subtle chains that bind so many in the guise of holiness. Part 5. The Consequences of Vice. What vice inevitably produces. Chapter 26. Inner disintegration of the human being. Vice begins subtly but grows relentlessly, gradually dismantling the inner harmony of the human being. Peace, once natural in alignment with the true principle, becomes elusive. Clarity of thought and feeling gives way to confusion, contradiction, and inner conflict. Strength of will diminishes as repeated indulgence in vice reinforces weakness. The Grail Message explains that vice does not merely affect behavior, it radiates through the soul, influencing perception, judgment, and the subtle forces that connect the human being to higher guidance. A person dominated by vice begins to feel fragmented, desires pull in conflicting directions, conscience hesitates or becomes silent, and the ability to discern truth from error is clouded. The more a soul yields to vice, the more it invites chaos into its inner life, producing a state of disintegration that affects every relationship and action. Chapter 27. The Law of Reciprocal Action. Every choice has consequence. Vice, being a deliberate deviation from lawfulness, sets in motion a law of reciprocal action. The energies emitted by selfishness, pride, malice, or indulgence return multiplied, creating circumstances that reflect the inner state outwardly. The Grail Message teaches that this is not punishment but natural law. What is sown radiationally is reaped. A viceful human being attracts misunderstandings, opposition, and loss. Relationships become strained, trust erodes, and life's flow is disturbed. This reciprocal law ensures that the consequences of vice are unavoidable. They may manifest immediately or gradually, yet they inevitably mirror the soul's internal condition. Recognizing this principle is the first step toward conscious correction and liberation. Chapter 28. Vice and the Loss of Intuition. Intuition, the soul's inner compass, diminishes as vice deepens. When the will repeatedly chooses what is contrary to law and light, the subtle sensitivity that enables recognition of truth becomes dulled. Decisions become reactive, emotions dominate, and guidance from higher radiations is ignored or misinterpreted. The Grail Message emphasizes that a loss of intuition is more dangerous than any external misfortune. Without this inner faculty, the human being drifts into error, unable to perceive the lawful path or recognize the subtle deceptions of self and others. The soul's radiations become clouded, and the connection to the guiding light weakens, making recovery increasingly difficult unless deliberate effort is made to restore purity and uprightness. Chapter 29. Vice is Bondage to Darkness. Vice binds the soul to darkness because every deliberate departure from the true principle strengthens the opposing currents. The human being loses freedom gradually, becoming a servant to desires, impulses, and influences that are contrary to law. The Grail Message illuminates that bondage is not external, it is internal, radiational, and moral. The more one indulges in vice, the less capacity remains for spontaneous upright action. Dark forces exploit this vulnerability, reinforcing weakness, deception, and further error. True freedom, the ability to act in alignment with law and truth, is only regained through recognition, repentance, and consistent application of moral discipline. Chapter 30. Vice and the Coming Judgment. All vice is ultimately unsustainable in the face of divine law and the radiational purification of the world. The Grail Message teaches that humanity is approaching a time of separation. The forces of light will prevail, and all persistent vice will be exposed and corrected. Judgment is not vengeance but a natural consequence of principle alignment. Those dominated by vice will face the inner and outer effects of their choices. The human being cannot carry vice forward into a new era of lawfulness. The inevitability of this judgment calls for urgent recognition, inner correction, and a conscious return to uprightness, for only through alignment with the true principle can one withstand the coming purifying currents and radiate light in the world. Part 6. Recognition and Liberation from Vice. The Path Back to Uprightness. Chapter 31. Honest Self-Recognition Without Excuses. The first step toward liberation is the clear, honest acknowledgement of vice within oneself. The Grail Message emphasizes that recognition is not condemnation but clarity. Many attempt to justify their errors, attributing them to environment, upbringing, or innate weakness. Yet vice is always a product of deliberate choices and radiational alignment. Seeing oneself honestly requires courage, the ability to face inner corruption without self-hatred, fear, or excuses. Honest self-recognition opens the gateway for change. It allows the soul to observe the patterns, understand the causes, and begin disentangling from habitual deviations. The process is radiant. It clarifies perception, strengthens the will, and initiates inner purification. Chapter 32. Separating from Vice in Thought First. Before external correction can be effective, the inner realm must be purified. Vice manifests first in thought, then emotion, then action. The Grail Message teaches that withdrawal from vice begins within, recognizing the seductive nature of erroneous thinking, observing it without indulgence, and consciously redirecting the mind toward lawful, virtuous patterns. This internal separation is subtle but powerful. Each deliberate refusal to entertain vice strengthens the soul's radiations, diminishes susceptibility to darkness, and prepares the individual to act uprightly in the outer world. Transformation without inner separation is temporary, mastery begins within. Chapter 33. Purifying the Will. Will is the human gateway for alignment with the true principle. Vice thrives where the will is weak, indecisive, or misdirected. Purifying the will involves consistent choice of truth over error, lawfulness over convenience, and uprightness over indulgence. The Grail Message instructs that repeated conscious decisions reinforce the soul's structure. Each time the will refuses a viceful impulse, clarity grows, radiations stabilize, and the human being becomes increasingly resistant to the deceptive allure of darkness. Will purified in this way becomes a guiding force, aligning thoughts, emotions, and actions with the true principle. Chapter 34. Replacing Vice with Virtue. Eliminating vice is not merely about restraint, it requires filling the vacuum with virtues. The Grail Message explains that vice tends to recur in the absence of lawfulness, as emptiness attracts old habits and dark influences. Every virtue cultivated, purity, humility, truthfulness, responsibility, acts as a protective and strengthening radiational structure. By consciously practicing virtues, the soul creates stability and resistance, transforming former patterns of vice into pathways of uprightness. The process is gradual but cumulative, producing lasting inner clarity and alignment with light. Chapter 35. Building a new inner structure. The final stage of liberation is constructing an enduring inner framework. Discipline, regular reflection, lawful rhythm, and conscious radiational alignment form the foundation. The Grail Message emphasizes that the human being must actively maintain this structure through daily self-observation, meditation, and practical virtuous action. A new inner structure resists relapse, stabilizes the will, and harmonizes thought, feeling, and action. It ensures that virtue becomes habitual, vice is disempowered, and the soul radiates strength and clarity. Through this disciplined inner architecture, the human being transitions from vulnerability to darkness to a life firmly rooted in the true principle. Part 7. Vice in the World Today. Humanity at the Threshold. Chapter 36. Collective Vice and Civilizational Decay. Vice is not only personal, it manifests collectively in societies. When individuals consistently choose deviation from law, the radiational field of a civilization weakens. Dishonesty, greed, exploitation, and corruption multiply, creating an environment in which darkness becomes pervasive. The Grail Message reveals that civilizations collapse inwardly before outward signs appear. Moral erosion precedes economic, political, or structural decay. When virtue is sidelined, society produces systems that favor selfish gain over truth, fear over clarity, and manipulation over responsibility. Collective vice attracts matching external forces, magnifying instability and suffering. Recognition of these patterns is the first step toward restoring lawful order. Chapter 37. False Progress and Moral Regression. Advancements in technology, knowledge, and material comfort are often mistaken for progress. Yet without virtues as the foundation, these developments become tools of regression. The Grail Message emphasizes that external achievements cannot replace inner alignment with law. Moral regression occurs when intellect, emotion, and will operate independently of the true principle. Cleverness without lawfulness enables exploitation, innovation without conscience permits destruction. Society may appear sophisticated, but its radiational decay indicates vulnerability and future collapse. True progress requires that outer development mirrors inner virtue. Chapter 38. Vice disguised as freedom. Many fall into the most dangerous deception, vice dressed as freedom. The Grail Message teaches that true freedom is the ability to align with law and radiate light. Vice, however, promises autonomy and liberation while binding the soul to error, habit, and darkness. This disguised vice seduces through self-interest, pleasure, and convenience. It convinces humanity that ignoring law is liberation, while each act of indulgence subtly diminishes strength, clarity, and moral discernment. Recognizing the difference between lawful freedom and viceful indulgence is essential for survival and spiritual integrity. Chapter 39. The Separation Between Upright and Corrupt. As collective and individual vice grows, the separation between those aligned with law and those who remain in darkness becomes unavoidable. Neutrality becomes increasingly impossible. The Grail Message explains that radiational forces act like a sieve. Clarity and strength are drawn together, while corruption isolates itself. This separation is natural, not judgmental. It occurs according to law, not emotion. Those who cultivate virtue and resist vice will find harmony and like-minded companions. Those who persist in deviation will increasingly experience inner and outer dissonance. Awareness of this separation empowers upright individuals to maintain focus, clarity, and moral integrity. Chapter 40. The End of Vice in the Light of Judgment. The culmination of history under the true principle is the reclamation of creation from vice. The Grail Message assures that lawfulness and virtue, radiationally aligned with light, will endure. Vice, by its nature, cannot survive in pure light. Judgment is the inevitable consequence of alignment, Uprightness is rewarded with stability, strength, and clarity. Persistent vice leads to dissolution, inner emptiness, and exposure to corrective forces. Humanity stands at the threshold of this purification. Only those consciously aligned with law, truth, and virtue will continue to radiate strength and serve the higher purpose of creation. Conclusion: the human being who overcomes vice. The path of the human being who overcomes vice is a journey inward, guided by awareness, choice, and steadfast alignment with the true principle. Vice is never imposed from without, it is always a self-chosen deviation from law. Therefore, liberation from vice begins with recognition, seeing clearly the patterns of thought, feeling, and action that perpetuate darkness. Freedom is the first reward of overcoming vice. It is not the absence of challenges or external restraint but the conscious mastery of will, thought, and emotion. An upright will rejects repetition of error and chooses truth consistently, even when the external environment encourages compromise. In this inner freedom, the soul experiences a radiational lightness, clarity, and resilience. Strength arises through discipline. Daily vigilance over one's inner life, thoughts, intentions, desires, is the training ground for lasting liberation. Discipline is not rigidity, it is the deliberate alignment of will with the law. This inner strength enables the human being to resist temptation, withstand emotional turbulence, and act in accordance with spiritual and moral order. Living clean in thought, word, and deed is the outward manifestation of this liberation. Vice leaves traces in every expression of life, whereas the upright human being radiates harmony, honesty, and responsibility. Words spoken are truthful and constructive, actions are measured and lawful, and the heart remains pure amidst external disorder. The Grail Message emphasizes that the victory over vice is not a singular act but a continuous effort. Each conscious choice, each refusal of indulgence, and each alignment with the true principle strengthens the soul and contributes to a radiational environment that supports life and light. In conclusion, the human being who overcomes vice becomes a beacon of lawfulness in a world often blinded by habitual darkness. Freedom, strength, and upright living are inseparable companions of one who walks consciously, day by day, in the light of the true principle. This is the ultimate reward of inner labor, a life of clarity, integrity, and constructive radiance, now and into the eternal future. Epilogue: the coming purification. Humanity stands at a decisive threshold. The Grail Message reveals that vice, in all its forms, be it pride, greed, anger, lust, or spiritual corruption, cannot endure in the era of awakening and clarification. The coming purification is not an external punishment but a natural consequence of the law. Only that which aligns with truth, order, and light can persist. Vice, by its very nature, is a deviation from law and cannot remain where the true principle takes hold. Self-deception, the veil behind which vice flourishes, is now exposed. Those who have long justified wrongdoing, indulged in habitual error, or dismissed the moral and spiritual order will confront the radiational truth of their inner state. No external authority imposes this revelation, it is the unavoidable effect of law. The human being cannot hide from the consequences of repeated vice. Darkness does not radiate light, and disorder cannot coexist with clarity. Only the clear, the upright, and the lawfully aligned will remain standing. Purification is the separation of the constructive from the destructive, the lawful from the corrupt. It is a refinement of the inner being, a clearing of all that distorts thought, feeling, and action. Those who have cultivated virtue, disciplined the will, and consciously aligned with the true principle will shine forth as examples of stability, strength, and radiational clarity. The Grail Message emphasizes that this purification is not fearsome but restorative. It liberates the soul from patterns of vice, exposing them so that correction is possible. For those willing to accept responsibility and live in harmony with law, the purification is a passage into freedom, lightness, and enduring strength. Conversely, those clinging to vice will find that the foundations of their inner life crumble, revealing the futility of self-chosen error. In the coming era, humanity is offered a choice: to stand in light or fall in darkness. The purification will distinguish clearly between these paths. Only that which is lawful, upright, and aligned with the true principle will endure, bringing radiational harmony, peace, and constructive presence into the world. Vice, by its very opposition to law, cannot withstand this inevitable clarification. The human being who seeks liberation now has the opportunity to consciously align with law, refine thought, strengthen the will, and live uprightly. In doing so, they are not only spared the collapse of inner structure but become part of the rising tide of light that will reshape the earth and the consciousness of humanity. The coming purification, therefore, is both a warning and an invitation. It ends the era of self-deception and opens the way to the eternal inheritance of clarity, freedom, and true strength. Appendix: Practical Tools for Liberation from Vice. 1. Meditations for Inner Cleansing and Strength. Meditation is the cornerstone for recognizing vice and purifying the inner being. Begin each day with quiet reflection, focusing on the inner self and radiational connection with the true principle. Visualize light entering every thought, feeling, and intention, dissolving shadows of vice. Recognize each habit, fear, or desire that deviates from law and consciously release it. Regular meditative practice strengthens the will, clarifies perception, and restores harmony to the soul, preparing it to resist recurring temptations and subtle distortions. 2. Exercises for identifying hidden vices. The first step toward liberation is recognition. Set aside moments for deliberate introspection, asking, where am I acting from self-interest, pride, or fear? Note recurring thoughts, impulses, and reactions that compromise clarity or virtue. Compare motives behind decisions. Are they lawful, or do they serve personal ego? Journaling these observations provides clarity over time, revealing patterns that otherwise remain invisible. Include social interactions. Notice subtle envy, impatience, or judgment. Awareness is the gateway to correction. 3. Daily practices for upright thought, speech, and action. Vice often enters through small, repeated lapses in thought or word. Practice daily vigilance. Speak only what is truthful and constructive, act according to law, and examine intentions before proceeding. When emotions arise, pause before reacting, allow inner guidance to direct choice. Maintain alignment with virtue through structured daily habits, starting the day with reflection, consciously choosing lawful actions throughout, and reviewing the day's conduct at night. Consistency cultivates an inner rhythm that strengthens uprightness and prevents regression into habitual vice. 4. Radiational alignment and purification prayers. Prayer is not only request but alignment. Use radiational prayers to attune yourself to law and the true principle. Affirm clarity, purity, and strength within yourself, asking for guidance to identify and release vice. Focus on the radiational field of your being, envisioning light saturating every cell of thought, feeling, and will. These exercises refine inner perception, heighten intuition, and create a protective radiational field that repels vice's subtle influence. 5. Weekly journaling for self-honesty, responsibility, and growth. Set aside a weekly review session to consolidate growth. Examine actions, decisions, and inner tendencies. Where was the will pure? Where was it compromised? Record discoveries honestly without self-judgment, noting areas of strength and weakness. Plan practical steps to correct deviations in the coming week. This structured reflection deepens self-responsibility, sharpens inner discernment, and builds a long-term pattern of upright living. Journaling transforms awareness into sustained behavioral and radiational change, ensuring liberation from vice is gradual, conscious, and complete.